Have you ever stopped to think if the people who remain in your life are really there for you, or just for what you represent to them? This question is unsettling because it touches on something almost no one wants to face. There's a comfortable idea we repeat throughout our lives. Those who stay, stay because of love. Those who remain, remain because there's something true, profound, almost sacred in that connection. This narrative is beautiful, simple, and easy to accept, but it can also be dangerously misleading. From a very young age, we are conditioned to believe that lasting relationships are proof of emotional worth. If someone has been by your side for years, it must mean something special. If someone hasn't left for conflicts, it must indeed be love. If someone remains present, then there is loyalty. But time, by itself, does not prove the quality of a bond. It only proves that the bond has not been broken. And this raises an uncomfortable question. What really keeps someone by your side? Think honestly. How many relationships have you seen that continue to exist, but have clearly lost their essence? People who talk every day, but no longer understand each other. Couples who stay together, but live like strangers. Friendships maintained out of habit, not real connection. If it were just love, shouldn't these relationships be light, natural, and spontaneous? So why do so many of them seem burdensome, repetitive, and even exhausting? There's something silent happening behind these permanent patterns, something unspoken, undiscussed, but which influences almost all human relationships. And this something begins to emerge when you ask a simple question. If you completely changed who you are today, would these people still be in your life? This question creates a small internal conflict because deep down, you know the answer might not be as obvious as it seems. Perhaps some people aren't truly connected with you, but with the version of you they've learned to use emotionally. Maybe they're there because you listen, because you validate, because you support, because you don't confront. Maybe you are, without realizing it, an important piece in their psychological balance. If that's true, then permanence isn't directly related to love. It's related to need. This changes everything, because necessity is not freedom. Necessity doesn't choose. It depends. And where there is dependence, there is also a type of bond that isn't exactly healthy, even if it seems stable on the outside. Now consider another situation. Has it ever happened that someone distanced themselves from you precisely when you began to change? When you became more independent, more self-aware, less emotionally available? Suddenly, that person who had always been there began to disappear, as if something had been broken. What was broken? The bond or the role you played in her life? This is a point that almost no one wants to explore because it reveals something uncomfortable. Many relationships are not sustained by who you are, but by the role you occupy. And when that role changes, the relationship begins to fail. This doesn't mean that all people are fake or that no bond is genuine, but it does mean that not all permanence is proof of emotional depth. Sometimes, it's just proof of quiet convenience. There is also another important detail. Many people stay not because they want to, but because they don't know how to leave. They stay out of habit, fear of change, insecurity, or lack of alternatives. And this creates an even stronger illusion, because constant presence comes to be interpreted as a choice, when in reality, it may simply be an inability to break free. And then another unsettling question arises. How many people are in your life by conscious choice? And how many are there simply because they never had the courage to leave? Do you see how this begins to dismantle the simple idea that whoever stays loves? The truth is more complex, more silent, and often more uncomfortable. Because looking at this requires you to also look at the other side of the equation. It's not just about why people stay in your life. It's also about why you keep certain people in yours. Have you ever held on to someone out of fear of being alone? Have you ever stayed in a relationship simply because it had become part of your routine? Have you ever confused familiarity with genuine connection? These questions create internal tension because they reveal that the problem isn't just with others. It's in the structure of the relationships we build without realizing it. Now, observe more closely. There are people who enter your life intensely, almost as if there were already a long-standing connection. They seem to understand you quickly, approach you easily, and in a short time. They already occupy a significant space in your routine. Everything seems natural, almost inevitable. But with Chimi, something's to change. Small discomforts appear. Silent expectations begin to emerge. You start to realize that, at times, you need to act in a certain way to maintain that connection. You need to respond in a specific way, to position yourself in a way that preserves the bond. And, without realizing it, you begin to adjust. This is a critical point, because when you start adjusting too much to keep someone in your life, there's a good chance the relationship isn't being sustained by who you are, but by what you offer emotionally. And this creates an invisible cycle. You offer something, the person stays. The person stays. You continue offering. And so, the bond remains alive, not necessarily through truth, but through functional exchange. Now, an even deeper question arises. If you stopped offering precisely what maintains this relationship, what would happen? The silence in response to this question speaks volumes. Because, at its core, there's an implicit fear of testing that response. A fear of discovering that some connections are more fragile than they seem. A fear of realizing that certain presences are conditional. And perhaps that's exactly why so many people avoid change within long-standing relationships. Not because they don't want to evolve, but because, subconsciously, they know that this evolution can alter or even break bonds, so they remain. They remain who they always were within that dynamic. They continue repeating behaviors that maintain the balance of the relationship. They continue occupying the same role, even if it limits their personal growth. And this reveals something silent, but extremely important. The stability of a relationship doesn't always mean it's healthy. Sometimes, it just means that no one has changed enough to destabilize the system. And it is precisely at this point that everything starts to get more profound. Because if relationships are sustained by functions, roles, and needs, then there's something behind it all that hasn't yet been fully revealed. Something that explains why certain people enter your life with such intensity. Something that explains why you connect with some people almost immediately, while others don't evoke anything at all. Something that, without you realizing it, may be shaping how you see, interpret, and connect with others. And when this starts to become clearer, a new layer of reality opens up. A layer where not everything that appears to be connected is, in fact, connected. And where, perhaps, you've never been dealing with people as they truly are. If people don't stay just because of love, then the question changes completely. What exactly are you offering someone to keep them in your life? This shift in perspective may seem simple, but it reveals a deeper layer of human relationships. Because when you start to observe carefully, you realize that many connections are sustained by invisible exchanges. They are not material exchanges, nor are they always conscious, but they are there, functioning all the time. Think of someone who always comes to you when they're feeling down. This person confides in you, talks about their problems, and finds relief in your words. You listen, offer advice, and provide support. There's a closeness there. There's a sense of connection. But now, imagine that, for some reason, you decide to stop offering this constant support. You remain polite and present, but you no longer assume this role of emotional support. What happens to this relationship? In many cases, as rapidly. The frequency of conversations decreases. Interest seems to wane, and suddenly, that connection that seemed strong begins to disappear. This doesn't happen because the person is necessarily bad, but because the foundation of the relationship was based on a specific role you played. Now, imagine another situation. A friendship where you are always the more available one. You respond quickly, you adapt, you maintain contact. The other person shows up when they want, responds in their own time, but knows you'll be there. There's an implicit balance. You maintain consistency, and they offer punctual presence. If one day you decide to act the same way she does, something changes. The rhythm of the relationship breaks down. Interest diminishes or silent conflicts arise. This happens because the dynamic has been altered. It wasn't just a casual friendship. It was a structure where each person occupied a specific role. These examples are common, but they are rarely analyzed in depth, because it's more comfortable to believe that people stay simply because they like you. It's easier to ignore the fact that, often, they stay because you fulfill something they need. And this doesn't just happen in friendships. In romantic relationships, this pattern can be even more intense. Imagine a couple where one person constantly validates the other. They praise, support, and reinforce their partner's self-esteem. Over time, this reinforcement becomes an essential part of the relationship. The other person begins to depend on this validation to feel good. Now, imagine that this validation diminishes, not due to a lack of feeling, but because the person begins to assert themselves more, to value themselves, to stop reinforcing everything all the time. What happens? In many cases, conflict has appeared. The relationship becomes strained, not because the love has ended, but because one of the foundations that sustained the bond has been affected. This reveals something important. Some relationships are not built solely on feelings, but on psychological needs. And these needs can be very specific. Some people need constant validation. Others need someone to listen to them without questioning. Some need to feel like they are in control. Others need someone who will never leave, no matter what happens. And often, you occupy that role without realizing it. You become the person who soothes, who understands, who yields, who supports. And this creates a strong bond, but not necessarily a free one, because deep down, there is a silent dependency being nurtured. Now comes an even more delicate point. You do that too. Just as someone might need you, you might need someone. Perhaps you keep certain people around because they make you feel important, because they give you attention, because they reinforce an image you have of yourself. Perhaps you keep someone in your life because that person listens to you like no one else, or because they are always there when you need them, or because you feel safer by their side. And that's not wrong in itself. The problem begins when that need becomes the basis of the relationship. Because when necessity is the foundation, freedom disappears. And when freedom disappears, the relationship begins to become functional, not genuine. Now, think of something even more specific. Have you ever noticed that you act differently with different people? With some, you're more easygoing. With others, you're more controlled. With some, you say everything. With others, you measure every word. Why does this happen? Because, unconsciously, you understand the role you need to play in each relationship to keep it functioning. And the most interesting thing is that this happens on both sides. The other person is also, often without realizing it, adapting to the role that keeps you around. This creates a system where everyone occupies a place, where each behavior reinforces the permanence of the other, where the relationship is sustained not necessarily by truth, but by the stability of the dynamic. And systems, when they are working, tend to maintain themselves, even if they are not healthy, even if they limit growth, even if they create silent discomforts. That's why some relationships last so long, even if they don't seem happy, because they work, not in the ideal emotional sense, but in the structural sense. They meet needs. Now a question arises that completely changes the way we look at all of this. If the relationship depends on a function, what happens when that function ceases to exist? The answer is simple, but difficult to accept. The relationship changes. Sometimes she adapts, sometimes she clashes, and, in many cases, she ends it. And that's precisely why so many people resist change within long-standing relationships. Because, deep down, there's a silent fear that change will reveal the true nature of the bond. A fear of discovering that, without that specific role, the connection might not hold up. This creates an invisible prison. You remain the same person within that relationship to avoid losing them. The other person continues to expect the same behavior to maintain balance. And so, both remain, even though, deep down, something no longer makes sense. But there is something even deeper behind all of this. Because these needs don't arise out of nowhere. They have an origin. They stem from past experiences, emotional patterns, and inner parts that seek fulfillment. And that means that often you're not just relating to the person in front of you, you are relating to something she carries, and she's doing exactly the same thing to you. And when you start to realize this, something changes in the way you see your own connections, because it's no longer just about behavior. It becomes about what is hidden behind it. And this opens the door to an even deeper question, one that begins to shift everything you thought you understood about human connection. If it's not simply about conscious need, then what's at play behind these choices that seem so automatic? There comes a point where all of this stops being just behavior and starts revealing something deeper. Because if relationships aren't sustained solely by conscious choices, then there's an invisible level guiding who enters, who stays, and who leaves your life. This is where a central idea developed by Carl Jung comes in. We don't just connect with people, but with internal images that we project onto them. In other words, you don't see the other person in a completely objective way. You see them through invisible filters, constructed by your own mind, and that completely changes the game. Because if you don't see the person as they truly are, then who are you really connecting with? Think carefully. Have you ever felt an intense connection with someone right from the start, as if that person were exactly what you were looking for? Everything seems to fit. The conversation flows. Interests seem aligned. There's an almost immediate feeling of closeness. But over time, that image begins to crack. Small behaviors that you used to ignore start to bother you. Attitudes that once seemed irrelevant begin to take on weight. And that initial feeling of this person is perfect for me begins to disappear. What changed? The person, or the way you saw them? From this perspective, at the beginning of many relationships, you're not dealing with the real person. You're dealing with a projection, an internal construct that mixes your expectations, your past experiences, and even parts of yourself that you haven't yet recognized. And this creates a powerful but unstable connection, because every achisomi point begins to fall. Now stop and observe a common situation. Someone enters your life and effortlessly occupies an important space. You feel that this person understands you like no one else. There is a strong, almost automatic connection. But this connection doesn't just come from the present. It comes from something older, something deeper. Perhaps this person represents something you missed in the past. Perhaps they have characteristics that you admire, but haven't developed in yourself. Perhaps they evoke emotions you already knew but never fully understood. And then comes the question that almost no one asks. Are you connecting with the person, or with what they awaken within you? This is the point where many relationships become confused, because the intensity of the connection doesn't necessarily mean it's real. Often, it simply means the projection is strong, and the stronger the projection, the greater the chance of disappointment in the future. But here's an even more interesting detail. The projections are not random. You don't project just anything onto just anyone. There's a pattern. There's an internal logic that makes you connect with certain profiles repeatedly. Have you ever noticed how some people enter into very similar relationships, even when changing partners or environments? The names change, the contexts change, but the conflicts remain the same. The dynamics repeat themselves. The frustrations follow a pattern. Why does this happen? Because what guides these choices isn't just the conscious mind. It's something deeper, something that seeks to repeat experiences until they are understood. And this leads to a major breakdown. Perhaps you're not choosing people. Perhaps you're being drawn to what you haven't yet resolved within yourself. Now, think of something even more uncomfortable. If you project parts of yourself onto others, then the way you see someone can say more about you than about the person themselves. When you intensely admire someone, what exactly are you seeing? When you become deeply irritated with someone, what does that reveal? When you feel an inexplicable connection, where does it come from? These questions shatter the idea that relationships are simply encounters between two independent people. They show that, in practice, every relationship is an encounter between two internal histories. And that explains why some connections seem so intense right from the start. It's not just about the present. It's about everything that's being activated at the same time. But here is the most critical point. When you connect with a projection, you create expectations that the other person cannot sustain, because she is not what you see her to be. And inevitably, the moment arrives when reality begins to set in. The person acts differently than you imagined. They don't match the image you created. They show sides that weren't within your projection. And it is at this moment that many relationships enter a crisis. Not because something suddenly broke, but because the illusion ceased to sustain the relationship. Now, a direct question arises. How many relationships, and not because the feelings faded, but because the connection fell apart? And more importantly, how many relationships continue to exist even after the projection has fallen, sustained only by habit, fear, or necessity? This creates an even more complex scenario. Some realize, on some level, that they're only real, but they still stay. They stay because a bond already exists, because a history already exists, because leaving would require confronting something that goes beyond the relationship. And this leads to another essential point. Projections not only create connections, they also keep relationships alive longer than they should, because even when reality appears, part of the mind continues trying to maintain the initial image. It continues trying to fit the person into what was projected at the beginning, and this generates internal conflict. You start noticing inconsistencies, but try to ignore them. You begin to feel discomfort, but rationalize it. You start questioning things, but convince yourself it's just a phase. Why is it so hard to accept when a connection isn't what it seemed to be? Perhaps because accepting this requires letting go not only of the person, but also of the image you've created of them. And letting go of an image can be harder than letting go of a real person. This explains why some relationships are so difficult to end, even when they no longer make sense. Because, ultimately, you're not just attached to the person, you're attached to what they represented. And this brings us to an even deeper point. If relationships are influenced by projections, then how you connect with others depends directly on how well you know yourself. The less you understand your own needs, your own patterns, and your own emotions, the more you project. And the more you project, the less you see the other person as they truly are. Now, imagine the opposite. What happens when someone begins to see themselves more clearly? Projections diminish. Expectations become more realistic. Connections cease to be based on fantasies and begin to be based on who people really are. But this has a side effect. Some relationships cease to make sense. Some connections lose their intensity. Some bonds simply can't be sustained anymore. And that can be uncomfortable because it shatters the illusion of stability. But it can also be liberating because, for the first time, you begin to connect with real people and not with images. And it is precisely at this point that everything begins to change. Because when you stop planning, you start seeing. And when you begin to see, certain truths become impossible to ignore. There's a specific moment in many relationships that almost no one notices happening, but which completely changes the structure of the bond. It's the moment when the illusion begins to lose its power and reality starts to take over. At first, everything seemed to fit. The connection was light, natural, almost automatic. There was a feeling of understanding, of closeness, of alignment. But, little by little, something changes. Small discomforts appear. Certain attitudes begin to generate doubt. What was once ignored starts to bother. And yet, the relationship continues. This is the point that is most confusing. If the connection isn't the same anymore, why don't people just leave? To understand this, it's worth considering a common situation. Imagine someone who has been in a relationship for years, but has realized that something is no longer working. The conversations are no longer deep, interest has waned, and conflicts have become repetitive. Yet, this person stays. This is not an isolated case. Studies in the field of behavior show that a large percentage of people remain in unsatisfactory relationships for extended periods. In some relationship surveys, More than 60% of people report having stayed in a relationship even knowing that it was no longer healthy. This doesn't happen due to a lack of awareness. In most cases, people know something is wrong. They feel it. They perceive it. They recognize the signs. So why do they continue? One of the strongest responses is the fear of loss. Not just of the person, but of what that person represents. Losing someone isn't just losing their presence. It's losing routine, identity, emotional security, and even a part of one's own history. Now, think about someone who has built years of their life alongside another person. There are memories, habits, plans, points of reference. Leaving that relationship doesn't just mean ending a bond. It means reorganizing one's entire emotional structure. And the human brain resists that. There is a psychological mechanism called loss aversion. It shows that for the human mind, losing something you already have has a greater impact than gaining something new. This explains why many people prefer to remain in something that no longer works, rather than face the unknown. But that's not the only factor. There is also the fear of loneliness. And this fear is not just social, it is profound. For many people, being alone means confronting thoughts, insecurities, and emotions that have been avoided for a long time. So the relationship, even an imperfect one, becomes a way to avoid this internal conflict. Now imagine another situation. A person realizes that the relationship is no longer the same, but decides to keep trying. They believe they can recover what existed before. They make an effort, try to change behaviors, recall good times, and insist on the idea that things can go back to how they were. This creates a cycle. The person is no longer living the current relationship. They are trying to maintain a past version of it, and this keeps the bond active, even though the real basis has completely changed. This pattern is more common than it seems. Many people don't stay because of the present, but because of the past. And this creates a very strong kind of attachment, because it's not just linked to the person, but to the memory of what that relationship once was. Now, an important question arises. Have you ever seen someone defending a relationship that clearly isn't working, but using arguments based on what it was like in the past? This happens because the mind tries to preserve coherence. It tries to justify its permanence to avoid the discomfort of admitting that something has lost its meaning. But there is an even quieter and deeper factor: the fear of confronting one's own identity outside of the relationship. In many cases, people without bond, they've become so accustomed to a specific role within the relationship that leaving it creates a feeling of emptiness. Who am I without this person? What will my routine be like? How will I deal with the silence? These questions are not simple, and often they are avoided. So, staying in place becomes an unconscious choice to maintain stability, even if that stability is not healthy. Now, observe something interesting. There are relationships where both sides know something is wrong, but neither makes the decision to leave. Continue repeat patterns, discuss the same problems, but remain together. This doesn't happen by chance. It's as if there's a silent agreement, an implicit understanding that it's easier to continue than to face the rupture. And this agreement keeps the relationship alive, even without a real connection, even without growth, even without clarity. This leads to an even deeper point. Not all permanence is a sign of strength. Sometimes it's a sign of resistance to change, and this resistance can be extremely powerful because change requires action. It requires decisions. It requires facing the unknown. Staying the same, on the other hand, only requires continuity, and the brain, naturally, tends to choose the path that requires the least immediate emotional effort. But there is a cost, a silent cost. Over time, remaining in something that no longer makes sense begins to generate internal wear and tear. Small frustrations accumulate. Feelings of dissatisfaction become frequent. The energy of the relationship changes. And gradually, this begins to affect not only the relationship, but also how the person sees themselves. Because remaining in something misaligned requires constant adaptation, you start avoiding certain topics. You start expressing yourself less. You start accepting situations you wouldn't have accepted before. And, without realizing it, you begin to drift away from who you really are. This creates an internal conflict. On one hand, the need to maintain stability. On the other, the realization that something no longer makes sense. And the more this conflict is ignored, the more it grows. Now, think of something even more straightforward. How many people do you know who say they are doing well, but show clear signs of dissatisfaction in their relationships? How many people continue to smile on the outside, but carry constant inner doubts? This contrast reveals something important. Not all permanence is visible as a problem. Often, it appears normal on the outside, but is fragile on the inside. And this brings us to a critical point. If people stay because of fear, habit, memory, or insecurity, then staying ceases to be a reliable indicator of real connection. It becomes merely a reflection of internal forces that are not always conscious. And when you start to see that, the way you interpret your own relationships changes completely, because it stops being about who stayed and starts being about why they stayed. And this change of perspective opens up space for even deeper reflection. If so many relationships are maintained by invisible factors, then how many of them would truly exist if all those layers were removed? This question doesn't have a simple answer, but she points to something that is becoming impossible to ignore. There is a silent force that keeps many relationships intact even when deep down they have lost their meaning. This force is not love, it is not deep connection, nor conscious commitment. It is something much simpler and, at the same time, much more difficult to perceive: the comfort of the familiar. Humans have a natural tendency to repeat what they already know. Even when a situation isn't ideal, the fact that it's predictable creates a sense of security. You know how the person reacts. You know how conversations unfold. You know what to expect. This reduces uncertainty, and the human mind avoids uncertainty. Now, imagine two possibilities. In the first, you continue in a relationship that no longer fully satisfies you, but that you understand, control, and can predict. In the second, you break that bond and enter uncharted territory, without guarantees, without predictability, without knowing what will happen. Which of these options requires more courage? Most people choose the first one, not because it's better, but because it's more familiar. This pattern appears in different forms. People who remain in friendships that no longer add value. Couples who stay together only because they have already built a routine. Family relationships that are maintained out of obligation, even when they generate constant emotional strain. What sustains all of this is not emotional intensity, but predictable stability. Now think about something specific. Has it ever happened to you that you know exactly how a conversation with someone will end before it even begins? You already know the arguments, the reactions, the conflicts. Everything follows a repeated script. Even so, the relationship continues. This shows that, often, it is not the quality of the interaction that maintains the bond, but familiarity with it. And there's an important detail in that. The brain interprets familiarity as safe, even if it's not positive. This means that a stressful relationship can be perceived as more comfortable than its absence, because within that stress, there is a known structure. There is a predictable pattern. There is a certain control. Now imagine the opposite. You decide to end an old relationship. In the first few days, there's a feeling of freedom, but soon after, something different emerges. An emptiness, a silence that didn't exist before, an absence of routine. This is a crucial moment, because this is where many people return. Not because the relationship was good, but because the emptiness of the new seems more uncomfortable than the weight of the old. This creates a cycle. The person leaves, feels the impact of the change, returns to what they already know, and further reinforces the idea that staying is safer than changing. And so, relationships continue to exist not because of monetary value, but because of resistance to the unknown. Now, there is an even deeper point. The comfort of the familiar lies not only in the relationship itself, but in the identity you have built within it. Within each relationship, you occupy a role. You are seen in a certain way. You act in a certain manner. You position yourself within a specific dynamic. Over time, this becomes part of who you believe yourself to be. And leaving that relationship means, in part, losing that role. Who are you outside of this dynamic? This question may seem simple, but it carries great weight, because many people have never stopped to build an identity outside of the relationships they maintain. So staying becomes a way of preserving not only the bond, but the very sense of identity. Now observe something interesting. When someone decides to truly change, not just superficially, some relationships automatically begin to shift. People who were once close start to drift apart. Old dynamics cease to function. This doesn't happen by chance. The change breaks the pattern, and when the pattern breaks, familiarity disappears. Without familiarity, the relationship loses one of its main pillars. This explains why growing up can be uncomfortable, not only internally, but also socially, because your growth can destabilize relationships that depended on your former self. And here a silent conflict arises. Do you remain the same person you've always been to maintain your relationships? Or are you willing to change, even knowing that it might push people away? This choice is rarely made consciously, but it is present in many moments of life. And most of the time, people choose to stick with what they already know, because change requires confronting something that goes beyond relationships. It requires confronting one's own uncertainty. Now think about how many decisions you've postponed simply because you didn't know exactly what would happen next. It wasn't necessarily fear of a negative outcome. It was fear of the unknown. This same mechanism operates in relationships. The absence of guarantees makes staying seem safer, even when it's not satisfactory. But there is a cost that almost no one clearly considers. When you stay with something simply out of familiarity, you limit your ability to experience different things. You restrict new connections, new possibilities, new ways of relating to others. You're trading growth for stability, and over time, this can create a feeling that's hard to explain, a feeling of stagnation. Everything seems to be in place, but nothing really evolves. The relationship continues, but it doesn't deepen. The coexistence exists, but it doesn't transform. The bond remains, but it doesn't grow. And this creates a kind of silent discomfort, because it's not an obvious problem. It's not a direct conflict, but it's an internal perception that something could be different. Now, a question arises that completely changes the perspective. If you weren't afraid of the unknown, which relationships would you maintain exactly as they are today? That's not an easy question to answer honestly, because it requires you to separate what is a real choice from what is merely a habit. And often, this separation reveals something uncomfortable. Some relationships only exist because you've never had the courage to question them deeply. And that doesn't mean they're useless or false, but it does mean that their permanence may not be based on what you believe. Now, imagine the impact of seeing this clearly. You begin to realize that not all stability is positive, that not every lasting relationship is healthy, that not every constant presence is a sign of real connection. And that changes the way you see everything around you, because you stop valuing only the duration of a relationship and start questioning its quality. And at that point, something starts to become impossible to ignore. If the comfort of the familiar keeps so many relationships alive, then how many of them would survive if you were completely open to the unknown? There comes a point when everything you've understood so far stops being just reflection and starts becoming a responsibility. Because, after realizing that many relationships aren't sustained by love, but by need, projection, and familiarity, you can no longer look at your own life in the same way. You start to notice patterns. You begin to notice who only approaches you at specific times. You start to identify which relationships require you to be an adapted version of yourself. You begin to feel more clearly when a connection is light and when it is sustained by constant effort. And that can be uncomfortable because seeing requires positioning. And this is where most people get stuck. They understand, but they don't apply. They recognize the patterns, but they continue to act the same way, not because of a lack of intelligence, but because changing how you relate involves risk, loss, and, above all, responsibility for your own choices. But there is a clear difference between knowing and transforming. Knowledge eases the conscience. Transformation alters reality. So the question stops being why do people stay in my life and becomes what do I do with this awareness? Now, the first step is simple, but it requires honesty. Observe without justifying. Look at your current relationships and do a straightforward analysis. Who do you feel you can be yourself with effortlessly? Who do you constantly need to adjust to? Who only shows up when they need something? And, perhaps most importantly, who do you stay with out of habit? Don't try to soften the answers. Don't try to defend anyone. This moment isn't about judgment. It's about clarity. The second step is to identify the role you play. In every relationship, you occupy a role. It could be the listener, the problem solver, the comma, the yielder, the supporter. Recognizing this is essential because often you are trapped not by the person, but by the role you have built within that dynamic. Now comes an important point. You don't need to break everything up impulsively. This isn't about destroying relationships. It's about transforming how you position yourself within them. Start by reducing automatic behaviors. If you always give in, try asserting yourself. If you're always available, try setting boundaries. If you always avoid conflict, try speaking clearly. Observe what happens. Some relationships will adapt. Others will become uncomfortable. Some may even drift apart. And that's part of the process. Because when you change, you reveal the true basis of your connections. The third step is learning to cope with emptiness. This is the most frightening point, but it's also the most transformative. When you stop maintaining relationships out of habit or necessity, an emptiness can emerge. Fewer messages, fewer interactions, fewer distractions. But this emptiness is not a loss. Space. Space for you to rebuild yourself without depending on external roles. Space to develop an identity that isn't based on pleasing, supporting, or maintaining. Space to create connections more aligned with who you truly are. Many people run away from this moment and return to old relationships just to avoid feeling this silence. But it is in this silence that real change happens. The fourth step is to redefine what you accept. After seeing all of this, you can no longer accept any kind of relationship as before. You begin to value relationships where there is reciprocity, freedom, and authenticity. You stop confusing intensity with depth. Stop confusing constant presence with real connection. Stop confusing need with choice. And that completely changes the type of people who stay in your life. Now, there is a point that needs to be stated clearly. Not everyone will follow your change. Some people will distance themselves because they can no longer relate to this new version of you. Others will try to maintain the old dynamic, hoping you'll go back to acting like you did before. And you're going to have to choose. Choosing between maintaining relationships based on what you already know isn't real, or sustaining the transformation even if it brings temporary discomfort. This choice defines everything because, in the end, it's not about who stays in your life. It's about who continues to matter after you stop being who you were. And, little by little, something begins to happen. Relationships that endure become lighter. Conversations become more genuine. Needs diminish and choices increase. You start to realize that you don't need to hold on to anyone for them to stay. And that's one of the most important changes. When someone stays, it's no longer because you're supporting, adapting, or filling a void. It's because there's genuine alignment. And this completely transforms the way you connect. Now, you no longer seek immediate intensity, but consistency. You no longer seek constant validation, but genuine presence. You no longer seek to maintain, but to choose. And, for the first time, your relationships cease to be an automatic reflection of your patterns and become a conscious extension of who you have become. Perhaps this won't be easy, but it's real. And it all starts with a simple decision To stop accepting connections based on illusion and start building relationships based on truth. If this content resonated with you, if at any point you recognized yourself in these situations, then it's worth continuing to deepen this type of understanding. Subscribe to the channel to follow future content. Like the video so that more people can access this reflection, and if you want, share any of your experiences or questions in the comments. You can do this anonymously because often what you experience can help other people see something they haven't yet been able to perceive.